Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them and how you can build it yourself.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by our sales coaching and consulting services. Are you looking to create repeatable, scalable, and predictable revenue? We've helped thousands of companies grow their business with tailored expert advice backed by testing to ensure they establish the best practices that'll work for them. Head over to bit.ly/predictable revenue coaching to learn more.
Andrew, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Collin, thank you for having me.
I'm excited because I play hockey like a good Canadian, and I play beer league hockey. Well, I mean, not anymore. I also used to teach hockey. And the one thing I noticed is in the beer league hockey, let's put it this way, like a lot of older people who play hockey or any sport, I'm not getting any better. I think you could probably argue, looking at the stat sheets, that I'm getting worse. And I think a lot of it is I'm only playing once a week. Or when I was playing, it was only once a week. Sometimes it'd be twice a week, but even still, I was playing games. I wasn't doing any practice. And I was thinking back to like, oh man, why are my hands garbage? Why is my shot awful? Why is my skating so rough? And I was thinking back to when it was good and I was on the ice constantly. Even when I wasn't on the ice, I was doing, hand drills with a little ball and stick handing around pucks. And the answer was I wasn't practicing anymore. You get old, I know how to play hockey. I don't need to practice anymore. But we're not here to talk about hockey. We're here to talk about sales. Because the same thing happens, and I've been guilty of it before. I spent a lot of time selling. I know how to sell. Why should I be practicing?
It is different because hockey is hockey and sales is sales. But there's a lot more similarities than I think we appreciate. And one of them is that hockey is an embodied skill. You can read a book all day long about how to be great at hockey and how to skate and balance. It makes no difference until you're out on the ice actually putting that knowledge into your body. And some of the knowledge isn't even explicit. It's tacit, like the feeling of the ice. I think the same is true of selling, that it is an embodied skill, and you only develop embodied skills through practice, and a particular type of practice at that. And you're right, the same thing happens in business, except I think we don't notice it because we have this word experience in business, which is the lie we tell ourselves that we're better because we've been doing it for a while, and therefore we don't need to practice anymore. I've got experience, why would I need to practice? And I'm sure we've all got experience of knowing people who've been in business for 30 or 40 years with lots of experience who are just not that good. And the reason is, when we don't practice, our skills get worse over time because bad habits creep in. I think the same is true in hockey as it is in selling. And so I am an advocate for salespeople being lifelong learners, but more than that, lifelong practices.
100%. And I think the analogy carries between the two. If I'm still running plays and things that worked for me 20 years ago, I'm playing a version of hockey that's 20 years old, and the game has adapted. And I think the same is true with selling. What buyers are expecting, the knowledge that they have, the expectations are different. The game has changed. And so we've got to keep our skills fresh.
Yeah. And some skills are fundamental and may last through time. But as you say, 10 years ago, we didn't have ChatGPT and the layers of tech between us and customers, some of which helps us, but a lot of which requires us to develop new skills so that the technology becomes an aid rather than an instrument that breaks trust with prospects and customers.
Totally. We're doing this across a giant ocean, and I used to only sell in person, and now I can sell to anyone, anywhere in the world using different technologies. And so while many of the skills have probably remained similar, the arenas that we're playing in are very, very different and require adaptations.
Yeah, and the feedback that we get is in different forms, and frankly, even harder to come by than it used to be. One way we used to get feedback is being on the same sales floor as our colleagues, listening in on them and them on us, and maybe some of that water cooler discussion. A lot of that's gone now. So for many of us and many sellers, working from a home office, it's really hard to get one of the several magic ingredients in impeccable practice, which is feedback from a coach that knows what excellence looks like.
It is the double-edged sword of the remote workforce and the remote selling game. Like, I used to be able to go and sit down with clients, and it was normal for me to fly to Oshkosh, Wisconsin to go see a client and get in front of this and this and that. Now these people are expecting a Zoom, and that's totally normal. And so it's definitely changed. And I don't want this to turn into two old guys talking about, oh, back in my day, I had to cold call on a rotary telephone. So I do want to get into, and I didn't have to, but my parents did have a rotary phone, and I could only imagine the poor people. Could only imagine. Let's talk about what are the critical skills, and maybe what is in your eyes, what is an embodied skill? Like, help me understand that, just in case we have people that are like, what does he mean by that? And then let's talk about what are the kind of critical skills we need to be practicing.
So let's distinguish between what I would call intellectual skills, being able to read a book and understand it, being able to answer a question based on a text. You might think of them as the skills that get you through school, a degree, and a doctorate, because they're academic in nature. Embodied skills are the skills of doing. So you could think of it as hitting a puck or throwing a ball through a hoop. That's one example. But leading an effective conversation is an embodied skill. Listening and asking the right questions in a choreographed way that builds trust. Storytelling, those are all great examples of embodied skills, as indeed is running an effective podcast or an effective sales meeting. Those are skills that are a combination of how you do things and, frankly, the choices that you make. So, for example, you might say, is listening a knowledge problem? Yes, of course, there's some knowledge to do with listening. But what distinguishes the great listeners from the merely good are choices like beginning by being silent, rather than leading with sharing your opinion. It's the skill of being able to listen to what people say, but below that to how they feel, and at the base of it, what really matters to them, because that's where they make decisions. Those are things that we don't do naturally, and that practice can help us to focus on, get good at, and eventually excel at.
I love that. It's one thing to intellectually know that I need to listen to prospects. It's another thing to know how to apply it and what it feels like when it works well. The right way to say it?
It is the right way to say it. And, for a lot of these embodied skills, I think right at the top of the stream is the source of the problem, which is our brains play tricks on us. And when we understand something intellectually, we confuse knowing how with being able to do something well. So I read a book on riding a bicycle. I assume I've got this, I understood it, that I can therefore do it. But it's not the case that understanding how means being good at doing. The only way to get good at doing something is practice with the right intention. You can talk a lot about mindsets. And in my view, with a coach who can give you the right kind of performance feedback.
I love that. And so we're going to talk about sort of questions, listening, storytelling. I know we talked about some other critical skills there's some other skills that aren't maybe the big three. What are some of the other ones that you think are really important for reps to practice?
Yeah, it depends where you are in the sales cycle. There are a bunch of skills around negotiating that really make a difference. For example, the skill to build your case by starting with an ambitious goal that addresses the gaps in your counterparty's plan B, rather than leading with the fears that we have in a negotiation. So there's a lot to do with negotiation. I would say the other big ones are how you present ideas, and right back upstream, how one presents yourself. We have a myth in sales that trust takes time to build. And all of our experiences mirror that myth. That's why it's a myth. It feels true. But all of the research says trust is something that's built in minutes, not months. And I think what we miss is we're often viewing ourselves as building trust when what we're actually doing is climbing out of a trust hole that we were put in because we made a bad first impression. And, and left to our own devices, a great impression made by someone with a label salesperson doesn't necessarily get the job done because people see us coming. They assume we're not trustworthy. So there's a layer of design, I believe, that's needed to break the mold. Oh, here comes another salesperson. Who are you? Salesperson. What do you want? To sell me something I don't need for a price I can't afford sooner than I need it. And that's a trust hole. The way you manage yourself when you first meet someone, in particular, how you introduce yourself, I think can avoid that. So it's a great example of a skill that makes a massive difference, because it can buy you 3 to 6 months in a deal cycle. When you're climbing out of that trust hole, someone else who made a great first impression is already in the process of discovery.
I love that. And to the listeners, I'm going to ask Andrew some practical tips on how do you do each of these? What is the way, what is the right way to ask questions and listen and introduce yourself, etc. We're going to get to that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about how, and maybe up a level, how and where should you practice?
It is a great question. I'm of the view that if you're not practicing every single day, you're missing an opportunity, because you don't have to spend a lot of time practicing. But if you have it as a disciplined practice every day and you only get 1% better every working day that you practice, in a year that levels you up 10x because of the compounding effect of practice. So the first thing I'll say is, rule number 1 is just showing up makes an extraordinary difference and has you stand apart from almost all professionals who don't spend time practicing, they spend time doing. And to your opening analogy, playing hockey once a week is not the same as practicing once a week, because your mindset is different. It's a performance, not a practice. The second thing I would say is the best place to practice is in a room with another human being. In a Zoom with another human being is not a bad alternative, especially if you're practicing Zoom technique, whatever that might mean. Mm-hmm. And the third thing I'll say is it's an environment inside of which you have the right mindsets, the tools that enable practice, and the freedom from distractions from practice. I like to think of it as the box inside of which wonderful practice can happen. And that box stops distractions from coming in, but it has written on the walls, what are you practicing? What outcome are you trying to achieve? And what specific actions are you going to take? So that there's intentionality behind the practice rather than, just let me hit shots and see what works. It's the difference between hitting shots at the goal and counting how many you get in versus stopping after each one and asking myself, where were my feet? Where were my hands? Or in a sales context, how did I demonstrate to my customer I was listening? Did I ask clarification or follow-up questions? Did I take notes and play back what I heard? So it's really granular, looking at, do I have a model of excellence inside this box? Do I have a coach ideally? And do I have the right mindset and intention? And then we can talk about what happens in the practice, but it's the box that matters, or as you call it, the place for practice.
I love it. One of the things that I think Zoom is like the remote is double-edged sword. One of the things that I found less awkward is sales coaching with reps over Zoom. And I know this sounds weird because it's a lower bandwidth conversation, but especially with newer reps, because I remember doing sales coaching I was a new hire and I had the CEO coming in, and I looked up to Michael, not just because he was the CEO, but also he was quite a bit taller than me. And
love it.
Yeah. And he was super, super helpful, but there was this level of awkwardness just the first couple times you role play. And what I've noticed is that being home, I'm also in the office, or I was in Michael's office, I was in somebody else's. It was a foreign, unsafe environment. And it wasn't unsafe, but it was a foreign or new environment to me. Getting a chance to practice at home, I'm in my cozy chair, I got my keyboard, I got my mouse, I got my water, my cup of coffee. I'm in my environment. And so I found it's just a little bit easier for some things, not for everything. It's obviously there's positives and negatives. So I wondered if you've, little sidebar, observe something similar.
I have. And actually it concerns me, because I believe one of the key reasons people don't practice is it doesn't occur to them that you need to practice because of the myth of experience. But the other is because practice that works is uncomfortable. And so when I hear, there's a way that makes practice a little easier, I ask myself, is it making it easier because it's degrading the quality of the practice? Or is it making it easier because it's improving the outcome of the practice? I'm for the latter. I'm worried about the former, because I see a lot of this, especially in sales coaching in the corporate environment. In many sales trainings, even when they're done well, and even when people love the experience, at best, I say, Collin, here's a new approach to asking questions. Try it out. You try it once. Maybe you get feedback, maybe even from a peer, which might not be the best feedback, but you get it. And then that's it. It's very seldom a chance for you to integrate that feedback and demonstrate you've heard it and applied it. That's where you're taking a bit of a vulnerable risk. So one of the things I'll say is if your practice isn't feeling uncomfortable, and if the feedback that you're getting isn't often what I describe as stingy, like, I didn't want to hear that. I know I need to, but I didn't like hearing it. I would urge you to turn the volume up a little, because I would say that until it gets so uncomfortable that it collapses you, the more uncomfortable, the more rapid the growth.
It is funny, you kind of had that feedback face of like, there is a minimum effective dose of feedback in order for it to be, make you make this face. That's when change is going to occur. When the person goes, oh, yeah, I hate listening to that part. I know what I did.
Yeah. I describe it as the difference between saying, Collin, you've got a beautiful smile, which you like to hear, and you've got spinach in your teeth, which you don't want to hear, especially late in a podcast. You don't, but you need to hear it. That's the difference between kind feedback and truthful but effective feedback.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm a leader, whether remote or in office, how do I build this culture of feedback? Because if I'm a sales manager, sales development manager, and I have 8 direct reports, I mean, if I'm going to do an hour of coaching with them, you say I should be doing coaching with them every day. So now that's 8 hours a day. If I'm a sales manager, I've got other things to do. So I'm curious here, what's your take here on what is that balance and what does it look like?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't put the onus of all my practice as a sales rep on my manager. I do think that a manager should be structuring practice sessions and having a one-on-one, probably no more than once a week, as part of the one-on-one, the deal review and the checking in on how the person is doing. There should be a piece of practice in there. That doesn't mean that that's the sum total of practice. I think that sellers should be pairing up with an accountability buddy, as I call them. So you and I agree, we're going to work on our listening skills this week. And maybe we have a joint manager who will, give us some of his or her expert feedback at the end of this week, presuming that they are better at the skill than we are. Mm-hmm. So as a manager, I would say the number one way to create a culture of feedback is not to walk into someone's office and say, hey, Collin, mind if I give you a little feedback? Because no one wants that ambush feedback. Mm-hmm. Instead, I would do 2 things. One, I would ask my sellers to take responsibility for designing their own feedback alliance. An alliance is me as a seller comes to you, Collin, my manager, and says, Collin, what I'm working on is my origin story when I introduce myself to new people. The outcome I'm going for is that people trust me in minutes. And the specific action I'm going to take is sharing a story about myself when I introduce myself, rather than a resume summary, which just confirms I'm a salesperson, versus a story which might reveal my humanity and offer a bridge to trust. So when sellers are driving their own performance improving and are making the request for feedback, it's not an ambush, it's more welcome, it's more likely to be absorbed and put into practice. And in the end, feedback that isn't put into practice is not a practice culture, it's a micromanaging culture. And then the second thing I'll say to managers is lead by example. Rather than listening to your great podcast and saying, you know what, I need to double down on the amount of feedback I give. I say to managers often, go spend a month doing nothing but asking your sellers for feedback on your performance as a manager. Teach them a feedback framework. I like using the 2x2 model that we use at the Kellogg Sales Institute and at Habits at Work, but you can use any psychologically sound feedback model and do it for a month. And after a couple of weeks, I've found many sellers go to managers and say, this is, you're asking for feedback. I can see you using it. Can I have a little bit from you? because it becomes clear that this is something that drives growth, that's valuable to the manager, and then we want some of it for ourselves.
This is such a key point to start on, or to start with. If you are, I think as a new manager, or I mean, even as a rep yourself, it's so easy to develop a culture of where feedback isn't the norm, where you're not because you don't want to, but it's just not a regular thing. And so the only time feedback comes up is when it's really negative, of like, you really screwed this thing up. And what I found was like, it was really hard to get up over the hump, that initial hump of, going from no feedback, no regular feedback conversation to a regular feedback conversation. And now that I've established that with the people I do one-on-ones with, it's normal. And they share feedback with me. And there's this like feeling of safety that they feel comfortable sharing with me, and they feel comfortable receiving feedback from me. I'd love if you could share a little bit about, you kind of mentioned some strategies to get there, but if somebody's listening to this and they're saying, I want to do this with my reps, but I just don't feel like I can get there, or I'm experienced enough, or I don't feel like I'm, good enough, or I don't have that relationship. What's some advice you would have for somebody who's in that position?
Yeah. The first thing I'll say is that having people show up for any practice is a whole lot better than nothing. So whether you feel capable as a coach in your new manager role, whether you think you've got a model of excellence or not, the greatest gift you can give to one of your sales team is simply as a discipline partner to say, practice your pitch on me before you go and practice on your prospect. Because wouldn't you rather have your worst day be in the office over a Zoom with your manager than out there blowing a deal that could be worth millions of dollars to you and hundreds of thousands of dollars in commissions potentially? So that's the first thing I'd say. The second I would say is to be clear that we are leveling up together. I may not be a great coach yet because I've been an individual contributor for years. I got promoted, wonderful, but being great at selling doesn't make you a great coach yet. It helps, but being able to do something is different from knowing how. So that distinction between knowledge and skills is one, but the difference from knowing how and being able to coach others on something is also a different skill. And it takes time to build. How do you do it? By practicing to be a coach. So that's why I say it would be great for new managers to start with the mindset. Let me be clear. First time as a manager, the fastest way to get good as a manager is to ask for feedback from my team on how I'm doing, including perhaps, and this is a little meta, how I'm doing as a feedback coach to them. A few other things to consider. If coaching isn't in your calendar, it's not going to happen. Even if it is, the chances are it'll get sort of replaced with something urgent because it feels like it's not urgent, and it isn't. But it's critically important because the greater the quality of your coaching, the more capable your sales team becomes without them needing to lean on you to close deals or guide their actions. So it is one of those upfront investments that pays off. And that brings me to my last point, which is wanting to do something almost never gets the job done. Here's a new manager who wants to be a great coach. It's like losing weight. We all want to lose a little couple of pounds, or we all want to be fitter. And my question is always, how's that working out for you? Because mere desire is seldom the recipe for sustained action. Because we run out of willpower and life gets in the way. So whatever you can do to remove motivation as the driver for this happening is a path to success. In other words, putting it in your calendar, having an accountability buddy that keeps you doing the practice, maybe making a commitment to your boss as a manager that you will show her every 2 weeks the transcripts of the one-on-one, something that calls you to account as a manager.
Huge difference between wanting to do something, talking about doing something, and deciding to do it. I remember when I did my first triathlon, I talked about it for 3 years and I didn't sign up for it. And then when I was like, okay, I'm going to do a longer race, and a longer race, I committed to myself. I'm like, I'm not going to talk to anybody about it until I've done it. And it was somewhere I read, it was about how your brain works. And you actually, in talking about the thing, you get the dopamine hit of actually the accomplishment of doing the thing. And then, so you actually use up all the like potential dopamine that you would get from doing that? So if you actually did the thing, it's going to be less enjoyable, or the victory would be less enjoyable because you've talked about it.
Derek Sivers has a great TEDx talk on this. And his point is sometimes, because I don't agree this is always the case, but sometimes a public declaration of intention feels the same to us as the accomplishment of the same thing. So you might be messing up your own best laid plans by telling everyone, I'm going to go and do this. As you say, I think you're onto it, which is being intentional about getting it done. I do find personally, though, that having a ruthless accountability buddy where I say, Collin, I'm committed to doing practice 3 times this week. And you're the kind of person who'll be like, Andrew, it's Wednesday. How many times have you done it? Not once? Great. Let's do it right now. And that brings me back to your first point. You said something about the frequency of feedback. The most common type of feedback in business today is none. Second most common is the 6-month performance review, which is mostly negative, or you're getting a promotion. It's not really feedback. It's a compensation and role discussion. Or if it is feedback, I always ask the question, does your business and your career deserve only feedback twice a year? And what are the implications for you, your career, and your company if your competitors are practicing 10 minutes every single day with feedback and you're doing it once every 6 months?
Totally. You think about the top level professionals in any sport or hobby, not hobby, I was going to say professional, but profession, they're getting feedback constantly. If you think about your favorite sporting athlete, every game they're reviewing the game tapes.
Yeah. And what I love about your example is the more they come close to the top of their profession, the greater the ratio of practice to performance. In the ultimate sense, maybe you're spending 4 years training and practicing for a 10-second Olympic sprint. That's a crazy ratio. Whereas in business, it's exactly the opposite way around. The more you mature and get promoted in business, the less practice is happening. When I think as a manager, I should be practicing more than my sellers. And as a leader of a business, even more than that.
You mentioned something earlier about practice being partly on the rep, partly on the manager. And you mentioned in the one-on-one. And so I'm curious, one of the things I struggled with as a new sales manager was a good one-on-one. You read, there's so many blog posts and so many books and so many things about, oh, you should ask questions, you shouldn't ask questions, you should ask the same questions, you should vary it up, you should do this, you should do a call review, you should do a pipeline review, you should do coaching. And I'm like, these one-on-ones, I've done one-on-ones at 15 minutes, I've done one-on-ones that were an hour and a half. Both were probably wrong, and the right amount of time is probably somewhere in between. But I'm curious from your perspective, what does a good one-on-one look like?
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about one-on-ones, I'm going to distinguish the type of one-on-one built for deliberate practice. You could have a one-on-one, which is a pipeline review or a career review, but really as a skills coaching or practice exercise, I would say the following elements need to be there. At the root of it is a structure inside of which a seller practices at least 3 times the same skills. A single practice with feedback that isn't implemented is feedback that's likely forgotten, and there's no embodiment of that feedback into the skill itself. So my golden rule is you practice the skill once, get feedback. Show me how you've integrated the feedback. Here's some more feedback. Show me a third time. Great, here's a last piece of feedback. I hope you wrote it all down. Next time we practice, let's start now on a established higher base. The second thing I'll say is that the way that you give feedback really matters, because there's feedback that helps and there's feedback that is useless. Like, good job, loved it, isn't feedback. It's kind, but useless. So feedback that really makes a difference is, here is exactly the one thing you did that made the biggest difference to your performance. And here is one thing you could do differently next time that either was missing, was present and could be improved, or was present and should be removed. So it's that double whammy of what you did well so that we focus on what has us stand out. You know, I love that old saying, if you want to be good, focus on your weaknesses, but if you want to be great, focus on your strengths. And then the do differently, which is a demonstration of how I could improve my performance. So the feedback itself has a quality element to it, and low quality feedback means less improvement. And the third thing I'd say is the magic ingredient is making sure that a seller shows up with an aligned mindset for greatness. What do I mean by that? Mostly when we practice, we're sort of unintentional and we're just doing the practice because a manager says do it. And so I'm focused on how I pitch my product offering, and then my manager gives me feedback on my body language, and it's all over the place. So an alliance that I strike, if I'm the seller, that says, Collin, here's what I'm practicing, here's the outcome I'm trying to produce, and what I want specific coaching on, it ensures that what I'm working on and what I'm focused on, what I reflect on as my own feedback on my performance, and the feedback that you give me is all nicely lined up. And that accelerates performance versus people who just get sort of whatever feedback occurs for the manager, which may or may not be where my head was focused in the moment. Does that make sense?
100%. It brought two thoughts, and I'll keep them very short. The one thing that was really helpful for me was when we implemented EOS, and it forced us to implement a scorecard. And on that scorecard, we do quarterly reviews that are not performance related. It's just quarterly feedback sessions as a way of establishing the sort of making sure we got an hour and a half every quarter to go through this. And there's more on the week-to-week basis, but as a baseline, this is one thing I like to do. And what I loved about the EOS scorecard is it said, score people on the values. -1, living examples of you living in examples against the values. 0, no examples, +1, examples supporting. And then the last piece was gets it, wants it, has the capacity. So do you get the role and how it comes together? Do you want it? Do you have the capacity, mental, physical, time to actually do the role? And that mechanism really allowed me to calibrate, okay, what specifically do I want to focus on, and where is the kind of pain point, or where do I want to direct this? And it gave me some way of being consistent instead of just being the last thing I thought about on the last call. And knowing that I had to do this on a quarterly basis, it baked that framework into my brain of when I'm thinking about feedback, I'm going to put it down in this format.
Yeah. You know, I have a particular bias to a model for feedback, but what I'm most enamored with what you said is that there's a structure, and hopefully a good one, but a structure brings freedom for creativity, frankly. It's a lot of people revolt against structure and say, it's very stifling, but it solves for what I think is the third and important leg in a practice session. One is, showing up and doing rather than just talking about it. The other is the quality of your feedback that you get. But the third is how coachable you are to absorb the feedback. You can hire the best coach in the world who gives you amazing feedback, but if you're closed to it, well, you've wasted your time and money. And structure often allows a seller to absorb feedback, even and especially when they maybe don't trust the other person fully yet. Because when you're in the driving seat asking for feedback, it's much less threatening than when my manager shows up, pops his or her head over the metaphorical divider between us and some feedback. Yeah. Totally. So it's got a lot to do with mindsets, and managers can help sellers get into the right mindset. But as a practicer myself, I would say the first mindset is feedback is a gift, not feedback is dangerous. And the second mindset is I want to get great at this, not I want to be good enough at this. Because as soon as you have that mindset, I want to be extraordinary, then the obvious thing is, who can coach me? Who can give me some feedback? Collin, you're my manager. I want some feedback, please, which is a very different tone of coachability than, well, here we go with our quarterly review again. I hope I don't get into trouble.
It's also from hey, I want some feedback. It's hard to be surprised with that and to fully grasp, okay, over the last 90 days, let me think about every single event. And so from a manager's perspective, I found it helpful to have these, I'm not particular about this particular one, but having these frameworks, having this consistent way of doing things, it helps you anchor the feedback. And so when you're going through, you're listening to a call, like, oh, I'll talk to them about this later, and I've got a little doc I added into. I think one of the things I struggled with the most was communicating and articulating my feedback in a way that actually got the message across. I would just, typical sales guy, I would just start talking, be like, okay, so, this and this and that, and, you're not good at this, so you need to work on that. And I remember getting into not arguments, but like I could see as a salesperson, you get very used to watching your message and seeing if it lands. And it was sort of like if you throw a football or a rugby ball and you could just see like what an ugly spiral. You're like watching it go across and land on the person's face. You're like, no, wait, stop. That was the ugliest toss ever. A piece that helped me was nonviolent communication. I'm curious if you've got a way of delivering feedback or communicating it or thinking about how you deliver it that works particularly well for yourself.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. That's a great question. I'm seldom asked, but it's a really important piece. There's a few things you can do up front that makes feedback more likely to land. For example, as a manager, I could ask for permission. Collin, I observed this meeting. I saw some things I think could help. May I share some feedback? And be genuine about, this is an option. If you're not feeling like it right now, you can say no, it's okay. I would encourage my sellers to go back a step and own it by striking an alliance and saying, Andrew, this is what I want feedback on. But I think there's also something you can do to screen your feedback to improve its quality. Because I think feedback's a set of gifts, specifically the did wells is a set of gifts and the do differentlys are gifts. I think of the acronym GIFTS as a filter for quality. So I ask myself, is the feedback I'm giving generous? Doesn't need to be kind and sort of untrue, but generous especially is for when I'm self-reflecting and I think, I blew that meeting. It was all a mess. Collin says to me, Andrew, what's one thing you did well in that meeting? And I say, nothing. It was terrible. A great coach will say, Andrew, slow down. Focus on the one thing you did well. It may not be profound, but until you can train your mind to find the did wells, you're missing the opportunity to amplify what's already working, often the shortcut to excellence. The I stands for immediate, because I think that feedback that happens weeks afterwards suffers a memory bias. And I've moved on. I was practicing my opening story today and I get feedback on it 3 weeks. And today I'm practicing my storytelling skills. There's not that connection. The other three, F stands for factual, because I think that feedback that sounds like good job is useless, but feedback that says, Collin, when you introduced that second point during the meeting, I saw our customer's face change. She smiled. Fact. Then she leaned back and crossed her arms and looked up. And I think that was a signal that she was considering it. Fact. So I want to be able to point to something I saw that I can say is evidence you produced the outcome you were going for. The T for me stands for truthful. My example earlier, you've got a great smile and you've got spinach in your teeth. The truth sometimes hurts, but I love it when I feel like, I wish that wasn't true, but I'm glad. I have a wonderful coach who the first time he met me, we're 5 minutes in, I'm in the audience, small group, he says, and there's Andrew sitting there looking how I was looking with too much product in his hair. I'm like, oh my God, did I put too much gel in my hair? I was mortified. And the truth is, he was right. Like I wasn't paying attention that day. And the last S is for specificity, which is, here's how I think you can improve. And I think that's what's missed in great coaching. A lot of managers will say, practice, here's what I think about it. But the most powerful feedback you can give is, here's how I think you could change. And as a bonus, let me show you how. Because being a model for someone is such a gift, because then they can see it in action and replicate that from seeing it versus have to imagine how they might perform. So GIFTS, generous, immediate, factual, truthful, and specific.
I love that. I want to highlight two things just for anybody who's listening who hasn't had an opportunity to give lots of feedback. I've asked these questions because I'm on the spectrum of used to be terrible at it to like might be okay at it. And so this is part of my journey at getting a little bit better. But I wanted to point out two ways that Andrew queued up the feedback here, or one way that he queued up and then how he delivered it. An important piece for me has been, it was based on an observation. Here's what I heard you say. And here's how I think you could get a little bit better. And everything else, these are all important pieces, generous, immediate, factual, truthful, specific. I think just stealing that language, if you're struggling, hey, this is what I observed, and making it as, removing as much of editorialization as you possibly can. I noticed you didn't do very good on that call. Not helpful. Not also very specific. But I noticed when you delivered pricing, the look on the prospect's face was this, is extremely specific. And I just wanted to point out that when you did this specific thing, I struggled so much to find the words to introduce the feedback. And then here's the corrective action. So when you did this, I noticed the prospect responded this way. Here's what you could do differently. Absolutely. I just wanted to highlight the things you just said because I struggled so much to nail that part. So I'm hopeful it's helping others.
Yeah. And you point to another phenomenon I've noticed, which is often feedback is at the compound move level. For example, go build better relationships with your customers. Well, if I've got a relationship problem, that's evidence I don't know how. So telling me to do the thing that I'm failing at harder or better doesn't help me. Tell me how I go and make better promises, or tell me how I ask connection questions to build affinity. Those are skill level or foundational, and they're small enough that I can act on them versus, go generate more leads. Right.
Like telling somebody who's learning to swim, you need to breathe more oxygen.
Exactly.
Yes, I know that.
Thank you.
I promised the listeners I would ask some specific questions about how to do each of these things. And I know I could turn this next section into 4 hours, and it probably deserves 4 hours. So we might have to have you back for these. But I wonder if we could go, you're somebody who spent a lot of time practicing and coaching and helping people practice. So I want to ask you, how do I do each of these? We can kind of give me the couple-minute version for each. And then we could talk about how people can get in touch if they want to get the whole story.
Perfect. So the gist of it, because you're right, it needs a fuller answer.
I could honestly do a whole podcast on each of these, and there would be tons.
So let's start with listening, because I think there are a few easy wins there. To listen, if you look it up, means to pay attention rather than to hear. So when you're practicing listening, you're actually practicing using your eyes, to a degree your ears, and your body to pay attention to someone. And that changed my world when it came to listening, because I used to make a show of listening, almost like, I hear what you're saying and let me repeat it to you. And now I remember, the most insulting experience is when I'm with someone and they're looking over my shoulder, because I know they're not paying attention to me equals they're not listening to me. So if listening is to pay attention to, it's an observation game. And notice, pay attention is because it's expensive. It's hard to do. What makes it easier is my golden rule: the best listeners begin by being silent. And I remember that by noticing that the word silent and the word listen, same 6 letters, just reordered. I think it's a beautiful coincidence, at least in English. Yeah.
Amazing.
And then listening ends with attending to what you notice. When you're listening to someone and you can hear what they say, see how they're feeling, and maybe through conversation, get to what really matters to them. You'll notice what they need. And sometimes all they need is to have been listened to. Sometimes they need a response. But if I go right upstream, for me, being an empathic listener begins with the mindset shift. My job isn't to fix, it's to feel with this person. So that's
sort of. Did my wife ask you to tell me that?
Empathic listening. Say again?
Did my wife ask you to tell me that?
She did. She sent me a note before.
I thought so.
When it comes to questions, the easy thing to say is ask more questions. People typically ask half as many as is optimal, which is about 14 in an average meeting, regardless of its length. I mean, if you've got a 5-minute meeting, of course not, but an hour-long meeting should have at least 10, preferably around 14 questions in it. And I think what turns a conversation into an interrogation is having the same type of questions and just going through them. And no one loves that. So a conversation is born from the choreography of different types of questions. Some questions that allow us to connect. Like, Collin, what's your favorite book and why? Some questions that get me what I need to know. What's your annual budget? Some questions that signal I'm listening. When you said $200,000, you mentioned that it's part your budget and part someone else's. Could you say more about that? There are some questions that focus action. So, Collin, if you're thinking about taking this step, what's the one thing that you could do tomorrow that would make the most progress? And then my favorite question types are questions that change perspective. For example, let's go to your retirement party. I know it's a long time away, but what would have to be true about your podcast series for you to look back on your career and say, that's the thing that had me make the biggest difference in my career? It's a question that really makes you think differently because it shifts the time, the place, or the perspective from which you look at things. So that's a little bit about the model of excellence for questions, and just a hint for storytelling. We say, I change my mind when you give me facts, figure, and evidence. So we tend to try and convince people with facts and figures. And although that's what it takes in the end, people are defensive against facts and figures that change their minds because it's going to change my mind and I don't want to change my mind. So we ignore them, we rationalize them, or we refute them. We dig in our heels. So the expert move in changing humans' minds is by presenting your facts and figures wrapped in a story, which occurs for us like a gift at the gates to the castle of our mind that we let in, and then the facts and figures can be released to do their mind-changing work. And the model of excellence for stories are, they should be as short as possible. You got to get to the conflict point as soon as possible. If you find a boring storyteller, there are people that are telling you a whole long rambling thing until you get to the point where you're like, what happened next? If you can get to the what happened next point in a sentence, it's the expert move in telling business stories. And of course, adding emotion and color into how you tell stories makes a difference.
Around the point. That's something I'm still working on, especially in my presentations. It's one thing to tell a story about a customer. It's another thing to keep it short.
Yeah. And that's why coaching is so excellent for stories. You know, when I go to my speaking coaches, the first thing they say to me is, Andrew, that story is wonderful, could be done in half the time. And by the time I'm through about 8 or 9 iterations, it's often at like 30% of the original length. And that's when I know it's getting crisp, but still as powerful. In fact, more powerful for its crispness.
Last 2 questions, I promise, because these are totally selfish questions. When you mentioned them, I was like, I'm going to ask because I'm personally curious. I mean, I'm annoyingly curious about everything, but how do I introduce myself? How do I present ideas? Because these are 2 things that I don't think I've put a lot of thought into, and I'd love these 2, and then we'll wrap it all up with a bow and tell people how they can get in touch with you.
Okay. Well, very briefly on presenting yourself. All the research says other people judge us in milliseconds from the time they see us coming to sitting down in front of us before we open our mouths to what we say in the first minutes, maybe 5 at the most. So, of course, the obvious things are eye contact and smiling before you open your mouth. But then in a sales role, most of us answer the question that other people are asking, who are you and what do you want, by confirming, I'm the head of sales at Habits at Work, can't wait to talk to you today. And what I'm leaving them suspecting my motive to be is self-interest, because salespeople have a reputation of being commission-driven, untrustworthy as a profession. It may not be true. It may not be true for you. But if you don't address that, you're going to be lumped in with all the other second-hand car salespeople from the proverbial list. So the expert move there is presenting yourself with a story that humanizes you, that explains why you're there other than self-interest. So for example, I might say, I have a 30-year track record in sales leadership, and sales education. But 2 years ago, I became a yoga teacher. And in that defining experience, I realized that just like yoga is an embodied skill, so is selling. And so for the last 5 years, or last 2 years, I've been on a tear telling everyone I can to think about sales as an embodied skill if you really care to be extraordinary. So it's a little bit about my track record, why I do what I do, because I'm fired up by this insight, or I'm passionate about changing the world, not I'm selling, sales training programs that help you present yourself well.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So like off the cuff, I'd love some feedback on because I've been thinking about changing how I do mine. And if we have a minute, you might give me some feedback.
Absolutely. Let's go around the room and introduce ourselves. Collin?
Cool. Yeah. Well, my name's Collin. I've spent 11 years as an entrepreneur, but and most of that has been in the demand gen space and helping companies build build paths to new customers. The thing that was a really formative experience for me was when we had Uber as a customer, and I had the same person suddenly was generating 30x the results with the same message, tool, system, process. And that was one of those experiences that broke my brain and my way of seeing the world. And it made me realize that product market fit is not binary. It exists on a curve. And that the system for truly generating any real value out of any demand gen program is a systems-based approach. Because if all we did was book those 300 meetings a month with 300 different reps, and they had those meetings, they're not going to go anywhere unless they're doing a strong discovery, unless they're managing their pipeline, and then they're nurturing those ups well. And so that's kind of those are kind of the highlights. I didn't practice this. I wasn't intending on bringing this here, but I'd love your thoughts on too long, too short. Am I leveraging Uber too much? Like it's the one that kind of comes to mind when I think about, like, it actually melted my brain when I looked at their numbers and went, this doesn't make any sense.
I think you got all the elements there. May I play it back to you and see how it feels for you, but with a little bit of the structure that I'm suggesting included?
Free coaching? Hell yeah.
If I were you, it's my first time introducing myself as Collin, I might say, my name is, pause, so you'll remember it, Collin, pause. In my first decade, I had the privilege of helping a lot of companies design their guide paths to close deals. But I had an experience at Uber where I found some salespeople with 300 times the results of the average or the worst. And what I realized was they weren't better salespeople, they had better systems. And as a result, I've dedicated my life and now have the extraordinary privilege of helping salespeople and sales leaders build systems that amplify their impact.
Yeah, yours is better.
Well, I'll tell you two tricks to the trade. One is it's always easier to do someone else's origin story. Here's why. Collin, you're an awesome human, but I'll tell you this, it's easier for me to see the greatness in you than it is for you to see it in yourself. So sometimes the best thing we can do is ask people who know, like, maybe love us, friends, family, professional coaches, to tell us, like, how would you play back my origin story? But it's usually the structure that gives it the kick, because you'll notice that middle piece is a poignant moment. And if I tell it as a story, like, this thing happened to me and it blew my mind, your words, suddenly as a listener, I'm leaned in versus, well, I spent 10 years doing this and then I went to Uber and then I'd realized this. And so now I do this. A resume summary is just boring and unemotional.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
I hope that was helpful.
It was so helpful. I'm going to go and replay this 1,000 times and work out a better version. I might even record it and send it to you in like a month when I nail it.
Of course.
Last question I promised to answer. I asked already, presenting ideas. We talked about introducing yourself. Let's land with, how do I present an idea?
Treat them like they're people. If I was presenting you, I would use your name. Here's my idea. Fast path to 10x in your deals. So I would, just like introducing a person, I would introduce them by name. I would share their origin story. Here's how I came up with this idea. And then I would present the idea as a present / a gift. Here is it for your consideration, lightly offered with a generous mindset. And knowing that gifts are to be unwrapped, I would realize that the way that people absorb information is through the combination of things. So I may present the idea as a concept matched with a story, or as a process matched with a metaphor, so that I can engage both the left and right side of someone's brain, and they have the technical bits to understand it, but the emotional bits to remember and feel about it like it's an idea they want to absorb. But thinking about it like I would introduce a person is the reminder for me, my ideas should come to life and have a personality just like a person.
I have enjoyed this podcast so much. This is my favorite part of running a podcast. It's just the opportunity to feel there too. I mean, one, I feel like there's a huge connection here, and I know it's all Andrew because of the amount of time and practice. I can tell I'm on the call with a real professional. And I'm not just saying this, I don't end every podcast by saying this, but there are definite differences and nothing against other guests, but you can definitely tell, and I imagine you can hear it as you're listening in. Andrew is a total pro at this. If people are looking to replicate or learn from you or work for you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
You're very kind to say that. Thank you. It means a lot to me because I've enjoyed this tremendously. And thank you for the offer to connect with people. I'm very open with my connections. I would love your listeners to connect with me on LinkedIn, which is where I'm most active. Our company website is Habits, spelled out HABITS, @AT-work, WRK. So habitsatwork.com. Lots of great information on there, including an opportunity to sign up for our Trust newsletter. And trust us, we don't sell you things there. It's our latest thinking on trust. I'm also a professional speaker, and I have a speaking website at Andrew Sykes, SYKES.com. So any of those, I'd welcome them. And of course, reach out to me on email, andrew@habitsatwork.com. Would love to hear what you thought of this episode, or indeed if you have a different point of view from what we've been talking about, Collin.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Andrew. I really enjoyed this.
It's been my privilege. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for coming on. And thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you all next week.